Hey everybody, it's Randy. Time for another lecture. Hey, so this week we're going to talk about images. We are going to go through some examples, and it should be a relatively quick lecture, so I would suggest perhaps that we get started. What do you say? All right. So let's do it the way we usually do it. We're going to go through a review of what we've talked about to this point, and then we'll talk about images in HTML and the actual media files that you would, make images from. So, and how they kind of, and we're not going to go into deep discussions about this. I mean, trust me, there's way more that we can talk about in that respect, but just understand that we'll go through some of those. All right, so the story where we are so far. We've created a set of pages that can link to each other, that link to the outside world, or at least a little bit, and that also link to your email address or to the creator's email address. And we've started to use some of the more kind of mainstream block level and inline elements or tags, and including such things as headers, list tags, whether that's ordered or unordered, definition lists, and then also kind of, highlighting tags such as strong and M for bolding and italicizing your text. But what we really want now is visuals. We want better visuals. And I know that some of you guys have jumped the gun and you've you dove straight into putting images in there early on. Just fine, but we're really going to go through this now, and part of this does matter in terms of how you guys perform your homework. So here is the basic image element, IMG. So you'll see that it is the three letters IMG, and then it has a what's called a source attribute, or SRC. And you'll see that that points to a file. And then there's also this thing called an alt, which we will talk a little bit more detail about. And the important thing to kind of take away from this is that this is one, IMG is one of those void elements that we kind of talked about early on in last week's lecture, in that it doesn't have a closing element. There's no /IMG tag in HTML. Okay, images have two required attributes in HTML5. Okay, that's if you want it to validate. The first is the SRC, which is where the image file is located, and the second is this alt, which really is a descriptive text for the image. Now let's talk about each one. So first off is the source attribute, this SRC. So this points to location, whether relative or absolute, of the image media file itself. Okay, and this generally follows the same sorts of rules as the href does for hyperlink tags. The major exception here is really not, it doesn't do fragments or jumps or bookmark URLs, the hash, hash and then an identifier, though in some web servers that can be kind of worked around. Realistically, in this circumstance, we don't really talk about it that's possible. Okay, down the road, it involves having to make changes to the web, how the web server behaves in order to get it to do that. And so again, it's way past what we're trying to get you guys to accomplish. So two examples I put here are. For once is like a relative link where it's clearly this is there's an image.jpg. JPG means JPEG, which is an image format. There are a few others which I don't really go into in this lecture, but if you wanted to list them off, there's JPEG. The major ones are JPEG, PNG or PNG, and then GIF, and we won't go into the holy war that is how to pronounce those three letters, but the two, so those three different image types are the majority, 99% of what you will see in terms of images that get put up on HTML pages. So the first one is a relative link, like you should be expecting, where it is a folder somewhere based on where the current HTML pages will be. There will be a subfolder called images, and inside of that there'll be a file called image.jpg. The other alternative would be to do a more complete URL, an absolute URL that includes the HTTP scheme, the colon, the double slash, the server name, and so on. So now let's switch up and talk about this alt attribute. So realistically, all images must have this attribute in order to be valid for HTML5. However, not all of these attributes have to have real content in them. So one possibility is for very small images or images that are inconsequential to the content of your site or of your page, you can leave the alt tag with 2 double quotes as what they call an empty string. Okay, so you can do the alt equals double quote, and you're good. Understand that if for some reason the image is doesn't actually download, this is what the browser will display. It's just going to display an area where the image would go with a little a little broken image thing, but nothing else. Okay, now show you the next one. When you provide an alt, in this case, I just came up with something, a field of poppies next to a yellow brick road, Wizard of Oz reference, but the same other attributes, the source being kind of a broken attribute, meaning it doesn't actually load an image, this is what you see instead. Okay, so there's the point of this is that you can there's an opportunity to provide content that describes what this image does, and there's a reason beyond the image not loading for us to do that. Okay, so want to summarize: the use of the alt attribute provides alternative information for an image if a user for some reason cannot view it. So, and the 3 obvious or the 2 obvious ones and 1 not so obvious for regular folks is 1 is a slow internet connection, 2 is if there's an error in the source attribute, meaning that it's an invalid URL or an invalid reference, and the third is the viewer is using what's called a screen reader. Now this is for visually impaired or people that that otherwise have trouble reading can actually have the image described to them in a manner that lets them glean some meaning from it. So, and this speaks to something called accessibility, which we're not really going to talk much about in this course, but it does come up later on in the series of courses here at the JC. So now we know all about this IMG tag, but what about what gets displayed? So let's talk briefly as I can, about preparing images for the web. Okay, we're going to talk about 4 things: selecting, sizing, cropping, and organizing. But first, a brief note about copyright. So I am a content creator. Okay, I'm a photographer by kind of my early trade. I've made films and do art, and so I have an opinion about these things. But let's talk about what the law says. Copyright exists to protect the content creator. So if you don't own an image, meaning you did not capture this image yourself using a camera, or you didn't create that image yourself using a drawing program or some other thing, and you use it, especially for commercial reasons, you need to have a license for the work, okay, for your use. Failure to do that is called infringement, and it's illegal. So just be aware that when you go to visit sites like Flickr or Google Photos or 500px or these sites exist for people to share their photos, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's free for you to use for your own purposes. Okay, so if you find an image that you love on the internet don't assume it's fair game for your website. Just keep it in mind. Now, with that in mind, there is something called Creative Commons, and you may have not heard of this. Maybe you have. creativecommons.org is the website that is in this presentation link. We won't really talk for very long on this, but just understand that it's a way for artists to be able to share their work with the public and provide an automatic license that lets people use their work subject to certain conditions. Now, they usually spell out in the license itself. And more information is available on Creative Commons. I'll show you an example of one of these, okay, coming up. So let's talk about selecting images files, or selecting images. You know, I'll be honest, it's somewhat of an aesthetic decision. Not every site is going to have the same a visual style, and so one person might select images that another person would be like, there's no way I'm using that. That said, you know, you should try and find images that are relevant to the content, to the written content of your site. And you should also try and find the most pleasing visually pleasing images that you can. So here's one example. This is one that I pulled from a site called Giphy, Giphy.com. It's, you know, they do animated GIF files. You can, this one obviously is a Pikachu from Pokemon. For all you Pokemon folks out there, I've got a 7-year-old kid who's totally into Pokemon. It's ridiculous. So you might think, oh yeah, this picture perfectly speaks to what I want to do, but you have to be careful because this image is undoubtedly copyrighted. Now, I'm certain you've seen this on social media sites, and to a certain degree, the content owners don't really do a ton of enforcement on that. But on social media, that has, Facebook and Twitter and all these other things, they provide their own. They're the actual repository of the content. If you took this file, downloaded it to your website, and hosted it on your website, you would be liable for the fact that that media is on your website and you don't have a license for it. Okay? Here's another one. This was actually pulled from Instagram. Again, Instagram hosts their photos. People put photos up there. They may or may not be Creative Commons licensed. You have to be watching for it. By default, Instagram photos are copyrighted, period. And that's it. And that you have no license and no default way to use those unless you took them yourself, in which case you're good. And finally, here's the Creative Commons example. Here's an image of an oak tree in a meadow. Okay. Now, specifically, this file is Creative Commons licensed, and so it does have. But at the same time, you'll see that this is the license, and it's clickable. And if you guys go on to the to look at the slides on my website, you can see these links. But this is the license. It's called CC BY, which means attribution, SA, which means share alike, and 3.0 is a version, meaning that as they refine the license, they increase the number here. And then it actually also links to where this file was found, which I found it on the Wikimedia Commons. So by providing this license, by providing this attribution visibly, then this is actually licensed correctly. I'm perfectly legal using this image for this particular one. The other two, not so much. But this is kind of what I'm trying to get to is if you want to use other people's images, you either have to purchase a license for them, or you have to abide by their Creative Commons license, or you have to take it yourself, or pay someone to take it for you. Okay. Okay, sizing image files. Now, the next step of this. So most digital cameras, and here's an example of one which is an overbuilt. This is a Canon 60D. I've blacked out. Unfortunately, I blacked it out. So, cameras like this, okay, shoot way in excess of 5 megapixels. Okay, so 5 megapixels is about a 1080p image from a television. Okay, so most cameras out there that are digital cameras that are shooting still images are going to be way bigger than 5 megapixels. So if you're using images from a Digicam, you need to use an application to resize it to be suitable for viewing on the web. There are apps available to you. Obviously, if you are on Windows or on a Mac, you do have the built-in photo kind of apps that they come with. So on a Mac, that'd be iPhoto. On Windows, I think it's Windows Photo Editor, something along those lines. You have free or you have built-in apps available to you. In addition, there are other options. So a couple on screen here is GIMP, which is a freely available software program called the GNU Image Manipulation Program. The other one is Pixlr, which is Pixlr, which is online or desktop based image editing. So meaning that you can edit a photo using your web browser. Pretty cool. Then there's ones that you do have to pay for. Some of them are not terribly expensive, like Pixelmator, which made a big splash a few years back. It's only $30, which again, for a student that's eating top ramen, maybe that's not a helpful thing to say. But the other one is that if you are flush with cash, there is always Adobe Photoshop or Lightroom, which are very, very advanced tools for doing photo editing and finishing, and and I use them. So I mean, I absolutely love their capability, but I wouldn't expect people just getting started to necessarily be in that kind of, making that level of an investment. So next thing, sizing image files. We want to consider resizing images to something more appropriate for a screen. Probably less than 1000 pixels square, meaning that if it's, think about most computer screens these days are like 1080p. So if you have something 1000 pixels, that's almost the size of the height of the screen. You could plausibly provide a file that big, and okay, if it makes sense. But generally speaking, you want to limit it to you want to keep it a little bit smaller than that. Now, you're getting started, so there's a lot of leeway here. Later on, it becomes a bit more like, well, the key thing to take away from this is that if you don't resize your photos, you can resize them in the browser, meaning that you can tell something, squish this photo into this size, okay? The trouble is that the browser is still downloading this enormous file, and that takes time, and people's broadband connections aren't always as fast as yours. So keep that in mind. Next is cropping images. So cropping has to do with where you take the portion of an image that you actually care about and you cut all of the rest of it out. So you'll notice that as I trace my mouse around this, you'll see that kind of maps to what's in this other image. So this was the original image, and this was the part that I cropped to. And you'll see that, for the same height, this is very small by comparison, whereas this is relatively close up. So it depends, again, on which you think is the most visually interesting look for your visitors, for your readers, viewers, and based on the image itself. Which of these is the right way will be an aesthetic choice. I understand that. Last thing we want to talk about here is organizing your images. You want to keep your images in their own folder on your site. So we recommend that you would choose a folder called Images that's under your public HTML folder. So if you have under your public underscore HTML folder, you'd create a folder called images, and then all of your images would go in there. And don't be afraid to rename those images, those files, so that they make sense to you. Because one of the most annoying things is going to an images folder and seeing a list of file names like img underscore 0280 is not going to kind of inform you what the image content is, and so then you're sifting through, tons of different things. So whereas if I put friendshugging.jpg as the file for oops, pardon me, and now I'm doing all sorts of crazy stuff. So there we go. Yep. Gee, look at me go. But if I had this be friendshugging.jpg, I could find that in the images folder right away, and it would not be a problem. Okay, so just keep in mind that organizing images is part of the job of developing a website. Last thing we're going to touch on here is really quickly is making images clickable. So one of the things that you'll find a lot is that people make images hot. They're linked to something, and so you'll generally will just wrap your img tag in a hyperlink tag, just like you would a text, and have it point to where you want the user to navigate. And all of those rules for hyperlinks can be used for these images, these image links. Remember, that's taking an A tag and putting it around the img tag in order to make it clickable. Okay, so relatively short, lecture this week. The next thing for you guys to do is pick up and run with the homework for this week or for this module. I know I think in terms of weeks, but we are blazing, man. We are 1/3 of the way through this class already, so definitely hope you guys are charged and that the quiz went okay. I'm gonna be doing grading probably today or tomorrow, and give you guys feedback and check in with you guys, make sure everything's cool. So in the meantime, hope you're having a good hope you had a great holiday. I hope you enjoyed yourselves on the 4th of July and the Independence Day, that whole nonsense. It's it's a thing, and I will talk to you soon. Okay, bye.